The air smelled of burnt sugar and death. I think it was sugar, rotting mangoes, fermenting in the heat of the orchard, their skins blackened by the flamethrowers that had swept through 2 days prior. Or perhaps it was the sweetness of gangrene. The mind plays tricks when you are 80, and it played tricks when I was 32. The memories are not files in a cabinet, orderly and indexed like the criminal records I used to manage at the Yokohama precinct. They are spilled ink, running together, obscuring the truth. I was peering through the periscope of the Type 97. We called it a medium tank that felt more like a heavy coffin. The glass block of the periscope had a hairline fracture running diagonally across the visual field. A piece of shrapnel from a mortar round had kissed it a week ago, or was it yesterday? Time was fluid in Luzon. The crack refracted the light, splitting the world outside into 2 disjointed realities. To the left, the smoldering trees were upright. To the right, they leaned drunkenly, severed by the flaw in the glass. It bothered me. It was a detail out of place, a distortion of evidence. In my previous life, before the khaki and the patties, I was a man who built cases on clarity. A smudge on a fingerprint card could ruin a prosecution. This crack was a smudge on my survival. Halt, came the order over the intercom. Or maybe it was just a kick to the driver's shoulder. The engine sputtered, the diesel rattle dying down to a heavy, wet idle. We were the rear guard. The 2nd Tank Division was bleeding out, retreating towards San Manuel. The Americans were pushing hard, a tidal wave of steel and logistics that we were trying to hold back with buckets. We had stopped near a cluster of nipa huts, or what was left of them, skeletons of wood and thatch. Track tension check, Sergeant Ito barked. Ito was a good man once, I believe. Now he was a frayed wire, sparking at the slightest touch. His eyes were always wide, the whites yellowed by jaundice and fear. I climbed out of the turret. The heat hit me like a physical blow, a heavy, damp blanket used to smother a fire. My uniform was stiff with sweat and grease. I moved to the suspension, checking the bogie wheels. My hands moved automatically, checking for play, for loose bolts, but my eyes were scanning the perimeter. It's a habit you don't lose. You scan a street corner for the pickpocket. You scan a jungle clearing for the sniper. That's when I saw it. Near the remains of a hut, resting on a bed of crushed fern, lay a pistol. It was a Type 14 Nambu. It looked staged. I walked over, my boots sinking into the soft, ash-covered mud. The battlefield is a chaotic place. Debris is scattered by violence, blast patterns, throw weights, the physics of destruction. But this pistol was lying parallel to a fallen beam, perfectly aligned. It was too Nate. It was a piece of evidence planted to be found. I picked it up. The weight was right, but the texture was wrong. It was clean. No mud on the grip, no rust on the barrel. In this humidity, metal begins to weep oxidation within hours. This gun had been wiped down recently. I dropped the magazine, fully loaded. I racked the slide to check the chamber, empty. I peered closer at the firing pin mechanism. It had been filed down. The steel was bright and raw where a file had bitten into it, rendering the weapon inert. A useless prop. Tanaka, what are you doing? Ito's voice cracked like a whip. Found something, Sergeant, I said, keeping my voice flat. The detective reporting to the desk sergeant. I examined the grip. The wood panels were slightly loose. I pried the left panel off with my thumbnail. Folded tightly inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a map, a hand-drawn overlay of the San Manuel sector, marked with a thick red line weaving through the ravines and riverbeds, a route I hadn't seen on our standard issue maps. A safe path, bypassing the American kill zones. Ito snatched the pistol and the map from my hands. He looked at the map, his eyes widening, the desperation in them replaced by a manic hope. A drop. Ito breathed. A courier must have been hit nearby. This is an officer's map. Look, Tanaka. It shows a way out. A way to flank them. He was looking at the route. I was looking at the paper. Sergeant, I said, the gun, the firing pin is filed. It cannot fire. It was damaged in the fight, idiot. Ito snapped, tucking the map into his tunic. This is luck. The Emperor is watching over us. He turned back to the tank, shouting for the driver to mount up. I stood there for a second, the phantom smell of the precinct coffee in my nose. I looked at my own fingers. They were stained with a faint, translucent grease from the map paper. I brought my hand to my face and inhaled. It wasn't the sharp, metallic scent of Japanese gun oil. It wasn't the acrid smell of our machinery. It was a heavy, savory smell. Animal fat, preservatives. It smelled like the tin of American sea rations we had found in a captured Jeep a month ago. It smelled of processed lard. Tanaka, move. I climbed back onto the hull. Ito was already inside, shouting coordinates to the lead tank over the radio. He thought he had found a lifeline. I looked at the grease on my thumb. It wasn't luck. It was bait, and we had just swallowed the hook. The interior of a Type 97 is a lesson in claustrophobia. It is a steel womb that promises safety, but delivers only noise and heat. If you have never been inside one, imagine sitting inside a church bell while a giant strikes it with a sledgehammer over and over again. Now add the smell of unwashed men, the bitter tang of hot oil, and the exhaust fumes that leak back into the fighting compartment. We were moving. The tracks clattered rhythmically. To a mechanic, it's the sound of locomotion. To me, it sounded like the tumblers of a safe falling into place, locking us in. I sat in my position, the vibration rattling my teeth. Sergeant Ito was up in the commander's cupola, glued to the radio handset. Unit 3, follow the ravine route. Reference point Delta 9. Ito shouted over the roar of the Mitsubishi diesel engine. He was confident now. The map had given him a purpose. The radio was our only link to the rest of the company. But today it was a curse. The static was atrocious. It wasn't just the usual background hiss of atmospheric interference. It was a rhythmic, piercing squeal that cut through the headset every few minutes. Most of the crew ignored it, their minds dulled by the monotony of the advance. But I couldn't. In Yokohama before the war, I worked the Vice Squad for a year. We spent nights listening to illegal wiretaps on the gambling dens run by the Yakuza. You learn to listen not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. You learn that a cough isn't always a cough. Sometimes it's a signal to fold a hand. I stared at the radio box, watching the needle on the signal strength meter jump. It was too structured to be random. Nature is chaotic. It doesn't keep time. This static had a tempo. It reminded me of the coded knocks the bookies used on the steel doors of the betting parlors. I pulled a small notepad from my breast pocket, my detective's log, the other crewmen called it. Mocking me. I licked the tip of my pencil and started to mark down the bursts. I watched the needle dance. It wasn't Morse code. It was simpler. It was a frequency shift pattern. I had seen something similar used by the harbor patrol to coordinate with smugglers. Crude. Effective, easy to hide in the noise. Ito was busy arguing with the driver about gear shifts. He didn't see me working. I transcribed the pattern for 5 minutes. The sweat dripped from my nose onto the paper, blurring the graphite. That was a 3. That was a 5. The pattern repeated. Groups of numbers. I looked at the map, not the lucky map Ito had found, but my own standard-issue grid map of Luzon. 3 to 5 to 7, 4 to 4 to 2. I traced the grid lines with a trembling finger. 3 to 5 to 7, that was the ravine entrance we had just passed. 4 to 4 to 2, that was the clearing 2 kilometers ahead. The radio squealed again. Grid 8 to 1 to 0. My stomach turned over, cold and hard. Grid 8 to 1 to 0 was the exact location of the lead tank, commanded by Lieutenant Sato. They had just radioed their position moments ago to confirm the waypoint on Ito's found map. The static wasn't interference. It was a beacon. Someone was transmitting a high-frequency pulse on our net, masking it as noise, relaying our positions to an external receiver. The realization hit me with the force of a conviction. The map wasn't just to lead us into a trap. It was to make us predictable. The safe route was a pre-registered firing lane. The radio static was the spotter confirming the targets. I looked up at Ito. He was smiling, wiping grime from his forehead, thinking he was the clever officer who saved the platoon. He was a dead man walking. "Sergeant," I yelled, reaching out to grab his shoulder. "The radio. Turn it off. It's a targeting." I never finished the sentence. Through the open hatch of the cupola, the world outside turned white. A split second later, the sound arrived, a thunderclap that vibrated through the steel hull, shaking the rivets in their sockets. I scrambled up to the periscope, shoving past the gunner. 50 meters ahead of us, Lieutenant Sato's tank was gone. In its place was a geyser of black earth and fire. The turret had been blown clean off, spinning in the air like a tossed coin, before crashing down into the mud. A direct hit, not a lucky shot. A calculated execution. The radio headset around my neck buzzed again. Next target was the shell that evaporated Lieutenant Sato's tank did not kill us, but it killed them. The concussion had snapped the track pins and shattered the optical sights, leaving us blind and immobile in a killing field that had been pre-calculated by a traitor's mathematics. We bilayed out into the smoke, dragging the wounded, scrambling like insects under the magnifying glass of the sun. Now, hours later, the sun was gone. We were subterranean creatures, huddled in the damp, cavernous cellar of a ruined Spanish mission. Above us, the stone arches of the church had been pulverized by artillery. Below, in the dark, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of wet limestone, ancient mold, and the copperpenny stench of fresh arterial blood. Sergeant Ito was dead. He hadn't died in the tank. He had died 20 minutes ago. Here in the dark, a piece of shrapnel finally working its way into a lung. He had drowned in his own fluids while clutching that cursed map, the one he thought was our salvation. I sat against the cold stone wall, my knees pulled to my chest, watching his body. Someone had thrown a tarp over him, but his boots stuck out. Standard issue, hobnailed, muddy, just like mine. I was the senior survivor of our crew. I should have been organizing a defense, checking ammunition, rallying the 3 privates who were staring at the flickering gas lantern with hollow, shell-shocked eyes. But I was paralyzed by the secret burning a hole in my mind. The traitor wasn't a voice on the radio anymore. He was here. He was part of the command structure. And I was just a gray-stained tank crewman, a former policeman with no badge and no authority, holding a theory that sounded like treason. "Attention," the command snapped through the cellar, sharp as a pistol crack. The murmuring of the wounded ceased. A group of officers descended the stone stairs, their boots clacking rhythmically. At the lead was Lieutenant Watanabe. I had only seen him from a distance before, the clean uniform, the saber he wore even in the jungle, the way he looked at the men not as comrades, but as inventory. He stepped into the pool of yellow light cast by the lantern. "Status report," Watanabe demanded, his voice smooth, lacking the ragged edge of exhaustion that plagued the rest of us. "Sergeant Ito is dead, sir." One of the privates stammered. "Tanaka is senior." Watanabe's eyes swept over the room, landing on me. He didn't look concerned. He looked efficient, like a man ticking a box. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, tapped a cigarette against the lid twice, then placed it between his lips. He lit it with a fluid, practiced motion, shielding the flame with a cupped hand despite the lack of wind. The motion froze my blood. The cellar vanished. The smell of blood and mold was replaced by the scent of brine and coal smoke. I stared at Lieutenant Watanabe. The face was liner, harder, the skin tanned by the tropical sun, but the bone structure was immutable. The slight scar intersecting the left eyebrow, I had seen it in his personnel file. My mind, trained to catalog the minutiae of criminal intent, began to race. Ishida hadn't just fled. He had reinvented himself. He had stolen a life, climbed the ranks, and was now selling us out to the Americans, unit by unit, coordinate by coordinate. I stood up. The movement was involuntary, propelled by a decade of police instinct that the army hadn't managed to beat out of me. "Sit down, soldier," Watanabe said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "We are moving out in 10 minutes. The Americans are bypassing this sector. We retreat to the ridge." "The ridge is a trap," I said. My voice was low, raspy, but it carried in the silence. Watanabe paused. He tilted his head, a predator assessing a noise in the brush. "Excuse me, the ridge is grid 4 to 4 to 2, I said, stepping closer. The privates looked at me with horror. "In the Imperial Army, you did not question an officer. You died for him. Just like the ravine was 3 to 5 to 7. Just like Sato's tank was 8 to 1 to 0. You're feeding them coordinates." Watanabe smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Battle fatigue. Restrain him." Two of his personal guards stepped forward, rifles lowered. "It's not fatigue, is it, Constable Ishida?" The name hit him like a physical blow. The smile vanished. The cigarette fell from his lips, scattering sparks on the damp floor. For a second, the mask of Lieutenant Watanabe dissolved, and I saw the fugitive Saburo Ishida, the cornered rat from the Yokohama docks. His eyes widened, pupils contracting in the lantern light. Pure, unadulterated shock. He recognized the look in my eyes. He knew I wasn't guessing. "What did you say?" he whispered, his hand drifting toward the Nambu pistol at his belt. "I said you're under arrest," I stated, the absurdity of the words ringing against the stone walls. "For treason against the Empire and the murder of a police officer in 1938. The air in the cellar grew electric. The soldiers looked from me to the lieutenant, confused, terrified. Watanabe's hand gripped his pistol. He wasn't going to arrest me. He was going to execute me right here. Blame it on insubordination. Blame it on madness. He drew the weapon. I braced myself, muscles coiling to lunge, knowing I was too far away. The world disintegrated. The cellar entrance exploded inward in a shower of stone and timber. Dust billowed in a choking cloud. The lantern was smashed, plunging us into chaos. Screams erupted as men scrambled in the dark. "Ambush!" Watanabe screamed, his voice cracking. "Americans at the gate. To your positions, defend the mission." Flashes of gunfire lit the smoke-filled stairwell. The Americans weren't bypassing us. They were here, likely guided by the very man shouting orders. I felt a hand grab my collar. It wasn't a comrade helping me up. It was Watanabe. He hauled me close, the barrel of his pistol jamming into my ribs. "You have a good memory." "Tanaka," he hissed in my ear, his breath hot and sour. "Too good. You're with me. If you speak again, I'll gut you." He shoved me toward the rear exit, into the deeper darkness of the catacombs. "Move." We're withdrawing. We were walking through the digestive tract of the island. The trail was a narrow, tortured ribbon of mud winding through the jungle, slick as oil and smelling of rotting vegetation. The rain was torrential, a relentless, hammering deluge that turned the world into a vertical river. It washed the sweat from our bodies, but couldn't touch the grime on our souls. I was walking at point, but I wasn't lading. I was being herded. Two of Watanabe's hand-picked men were behind me, their bayonets uncomfortably close to my kidneys. Watanabe was 10 paces ahead, a shadow against the darker shadows of the trees. We were separated from the main group, ostensibly a scouting element to secure the retreat path. But I knew the truth. I was a loose end being walked to a quiet place for disposal. The mud sucked at my boots, a rhythm of despair. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. My mind drifted, untethered. I thought of the tea shop in Yokohama where I used to sit on rainy Tuesdays, watching the street. I thought of the ledger I kept, noting the comings and goings of the Yakuza bagmen. I had believed in order then. I had believed that if you gathered enough facts, truth would emerge and justice would follow. What a naive fool I had been. In war, truth is the first casualty, and justice is just a word politicians use to sell bonds. "Keep moving," one of the guards grunted, prodding me with his rifle butt. "Stop dragging your feet." "Where are we going?" I asked, wiping rain from my eyes. The regiment rallied at the river. "We're moving away from them." "A lieutenant's orders. Secure the flank. Secure the flank." Police code for "take him for a ride." We trudged on for another kilometer. The artillery fire was distant now, a low rumble like a summer storm, but the tension in the air was close and suffocating. We reached a small rise, a break in the canopy where the rain felt even heavier without the leaves to break it. Suddenly, the sky tore open. An American illumination flare burst overhead. It hung in the air, swinging beneath its parachute, bathing the jungle in a sickly, chemical green light. The shadows lengthened and twisted. The raindrops looked like falling emeralds. In that stark, unforgiving light, the scene froze. Watanabe was standing by a tree stump, facing away from us, toward the valley below where the American lines were established. He was holding a device, a small signal lamp with a directional shutter. He was flashing a message, not a random flicker, a code. My brain, that cursed machine, translated it instantly. He wasn't just signaling our position. He was negotiating. He was offering a prisoner, me, as a token of good faith for his own extraction. He was selling me to the enemy to buy his passage out. The two guards behind me stopped. The green light illuminated their faces. I saw the confusion ripple across their features, followed by a slow, dawning horror. They looked at the lieutenant, then at the lamp, then at the American lines. "Sir," one of them called out, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Watanabe spun around, the lamp still in his hand. The flare was dying, sputtering out, but there was enough light to see the panic in his eyes. He had been caught, not by a detective, but by his own men. "Silence," Watanabe barked, reaching for his pistol. "It's a ruse." To confuse them, but the guard lowered his rifle, the tip of the bayonet wavering. "You're signaling them. It was the hesitation I needed. The gap in the pattern. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply acted." I spun on my heel, slamming my shoulder into the chest of the guard on my right. The mud gave way beneath us, and we went down in a tangle of limbs and wet canvas. He shouted, his rifle flying from his grip. I scrambled on all fours, clawing through the sludge, my fingers closing around the cold wood of his Arisaka rifle. The second guard was shouting, paralyzed by indecision, unsure who the traitor was. "Shoot him," Watanabe screamed, firing his pistol blindly into the dark. "Kill him." I rolled onto my back, the mud coating my eyes, my mouth. I brought the rifle up. The bolt was already cycled. The flare died, plunging us back into darkness. But I didn't need light. I had the image burned into my retina. The position of the tree stump, the height of the man, the angle of his turn. I was back in the police reign. Target acquisition, breath control, squeeze, don't pull. To fire on a superior officer was the ultimate sin. It was a spiritual death, a betrayal of everything I had been taught since birth. But Saburo Ishida was not an officer. He was a criminal, and I was the police. "Tanaka," Watanabe's voice came from the dark, desperate and close. I fired. The recoil slammed into my bruised shoulder. The muzzle flash was a brief, blinding sun. There was a wet thud, followed by a silence so profound it drowned out the rain. I lay in the mud, panting, the rifle hot in my hands. The other guards were silent. Slowly, beam by beam, their flashlights clicked on. They swept the clearing. Watanabe lay face down near the stump. The signal lamp was shattered next to him. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt a heavy, crushing hollowness. I had solved the case. I had stopped the leak. But the tank was still destroyed. Ito was still dead. The war was still lost. One of the guards walked over to me. He looked down, the flashlight blinding me. He didn't raise his rifle. He reached down and offered me a hand. "He was selling us," the guard whispered, his voice thick with betrayal. "Yes," I said, taking his hand and pulling myself out of the muck. "He was." We left the body where it fell. We didn't bury him. We walked back into the jungle, away from the American lines, back toward a doom that was certain, but at least was our own. I survived the war, obviously. I survived the surrender, the camps, and the long boat ride back to a home that no longer existed. Yokohama was a skeleton of ash and twisted steel. The precinct house was gone. The records were gone. I tried to go back to police work in '46. They needed men, but I couldn't do it. I would stand on a street corner, watching the crowds, and I wouldn't see people. I would see vectors of threat. I would see liars. I would see Lieutenant Watanabe in every suit, every smile. I realized then that you cannot arrest war. You cannot handcuff a trauma and put it in a cell. You can only carry it. My deduction skills, once my pride, became my curse. I see the patterns of betrayal everywhere now. I remember every face of every man who died because of a map that was a lie. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. It cuts me every time I move, every time I breathe. But I cannot remove it, for to remove it would be to forget them. And I am the only witness left. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.